Some people have been talking about peak oil for a long time now, but when the International Energy Agency adds its voice to that debate and says that will come in the next decade, it may be time for the energy sector to sit up and take notice. Tom Rand is with us now from ArcTern Ventures. And Tom, we talk regularly about the opportunities in moving beyond oil. It's what you do for a living. But I guess I want to start with, it's been a recurring conversation, but it really feels as though the warning can't be any clearer. We've heard it from big oil companies. We've heard it from big investors, and now the IEA saying, the best times are behind us. What should happen when we hear this information?
Well, the IEA, as you know, historically, it's really an advocate for oil and gas. It's an energy security agency. And I've read every one of their reports the past 10 years, and they're interesting because they, on one hand, have never hedged their bets or their language around climate risk. They've always been an honest broker about climate risk. But they've always, historically, massively underestimated the role of renewables. Every year, they up their predictions for solar, and every year they're off by an enormous amount. And so that's what I think is really interesting. This is the first time they've come out and said solar is going to be the king of energy. They're predicting that renewables will supply roughly 80% of the increased energy demand between now and 2030. They've never been that bullish on renewables before. They've always been kind of defensive about oil and gas because it's useful. And that's kind of where they sit, is on energy security. So that change in tone is very interesting. What they've missed, I think, which is important, and they'll begin to think about, I think, in years to come, is the role of energy storage, which is where the real ceiling for renewables gets broken open because it becomes baseload or dispatchable power. And they'll, I predict, begin to get a handle on the plummeting costs of storage in the next year or two.
From a Canadian point of view, this is a slow-moving story, and we know that we had hopes, I think, for more from the throne speech than we got in terms of a vision for how to make this transition. Where do you think Alberta and other energy-rich places of this country fit in when we hear this? You talk about opportunities like storage. There are many other alternative energy opportunities. Are we where we should be right now?
No, we're not, because we're still focused in our national conversation about the right of the incumbents and the financial relevance of the incumbents expanding production, right? And that horse has left the barn. Expansion is off the table. And I think COVID, the words of BP, Shell, Total, in talking about their own view of writing off assets, it's time to stop talking about expansion. I think once we do that, and I think in people's hearts they kind of understand we're not going to expand it anymore, then you have a much more interesting conversation about, okay, how might we redeploy our competitive advantage? Alberta, for example, on one hand, they're talking about hydrogen, which I think is nonsense for a bunch of reasons, but they're also talking about geothermal, where they're leveraging both their geography as well as a long history of drilling. And that drilling technology is being translated into companies like Ivor into a potentially globally relevant new source of baseload power. So I do think there are ways to leverage our advantages, leverage our skill sets and so on in this changing economy. There are better and worse ways to do that. And it is time, and I think it's beginning to happen, that our conversation nationally is more strategic in nature than tactical, right? Defending the incumbents' right to ship more oil is always very tactical. Now we can begin to get strategic. And I think that's where an interesting conversation between the public and private sectors can begin to take place.
You mentioned Alberta's ambitious being a hydrogen exporter by 2040. Why do you think that's not all it's cracked up to be?
Well, on the one hand, unless you're going to sequester the carbon that you get from stripping the natural gas to get the hydrogen, it's not clean tech. It's not clean energy. It's a panacea. And if you do sequester that carbon, the economics get pretty difficult. And I fail to see what competitive advantage Alberta has on production of hydrogen. They've got natural gas, but you got to get the hydrogen where it's going. You got to sequester that natural gas. I don't see it. I think it's, and it's telling to say that Alberta's strategy around hydrogen is 3 pages at the end of a 27-page report that talks about increased natural gas and fossil fuel production. So it's an addendum to the status quo. And I think it's the incumbents flailing to try to do more of the same in a changing world. The geothermal thing is very different. I think that is more strategically interesting. Again, I think that's another way in which we can be strategic about these conversations rather than tactical. Hydrogen seems tactical to me, not strategic.
We have this PBO analysis of how well we're doing or how poorly we're doing, I guess is the way to put it, on our emissions and whether we can meet our targets. And the kind of solid answer seems to be, unless we do something drastically different, no. And that the price put on carbon is going to, the consumer price is going to have to be materially above where it currently sits. Is any of this factor in, do you think, into change policy behavior, or is this kind of background noise for the folks that are actually making decisions now?
Surprise, what we're doing is not enough. And surprise, a token price on carbon, which has always seemed to be able to get through politically, won't do the trick. I mean, those of us who've been climate hawks for a decade have been warning about this. You cannot nibble around the edges in the year 2020 and expect to meet your targets. And at best, we're nibbling around the edges, and we're discovering that now. So, that's why, for example, Mark Jacquard talks a lot about a price on carbon being a very efficient way of solving this problem. But this late in the game is not enough, right? We need ways to short circuit this transition, and we're now stuck with less efficient ways of getting that done. So I think the challenge we have is, how is it that we talk about that emissions reductions piece while at the same time talking about our economic advantage? And I and others have always maintained that those two pieces come together when we talk about Canada's clean tech export strategy. And I know our business pages are dominated by the large energy incumbents because they're big, single, large entities that have the capacity to take up that media space and mind space. But the clean tech industry in this country is not smaller, right? There's 55,000 jobs, spends more on R&D than the entire oil and gas sector, but it's composed of small companies that individually are not large enough to make the front pages of the Globe and Mail business newspaper. And so when we look at in aggregate of the clean tech activity in this country, in aggregate it is large. And the challenge now is, how does the public and private sector coordinate activity, not to pick winners, I always make this distinction, to back winners, to find Canadian clean tech champions that are capable and have shown they're capable of competing in global markets, big contracts, tier one customers, and so on. How do we provide structural support for those SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, the same way we provide structural support for our big players like Bombardier and Suncor and so on?
And we're going to talk more about that, because that's obviously hugely important. We've got 30 seconds here, but we haven't talked since the plastics ban, which seems to me to be very political and kind of retail politics rather than anything else. But what's your view on it?
You can actually upgrade plastic into high-value waxes. So I think if we approach this the right way, you can make money solving that problem. But I agree, it's a highly politicized debate.
Tom Rand, always great to have your input. Appreciate it. Tom Rand is the managing partner at ArcTern Ventures.